Where is India going today? Is it surging, having just overtaken the United Kingdom to become the fifth largest economy in the world? Or is it flailing, especially when it comes to job creation? Are manufacturers across the world jostling to make in India, or has India missed the manufacturing bus? Is India preparing for the future, or is it too focused on battling the past? These are two sides of the debate, but hopefully less debate on the fact that India needs a vision of where it wants to go, because that determines the choices that we make today. So that's how the authors introduce this book, Breaking the Mould, Reimagining India's Economic Future. It's an introduction that makes you sit up and take note, more so because the authors are former Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, former Chief Economist of the International Monetary Fund, and Professor Dr. Raghuram Rajan, and Rohit Lamba, economist, assistant professor of economics at Pennsylvania State University, who's worked with two chief economic advisors in India. Thank you both very much for joining us on NDTV. Like I said, you got us sitting up and taking note, so I'm going to get right to it. You talk about a uniquely Indian way of development, which capitalizes on India's strengths. So what are the key elements for someone who's about to read this book and needs a flavor?
Well, what are India's strengths, right? First, of course, we have our democracy. Second, we have the fact that we speak the English language, about 12-13% of the economy. Third, we have a strength over the years that we've built in services. And so let's look at how we can develop this based on our strengths going forward. So one of the important facts we start out with is so many companies are coming to India to look for to look for workers, to create jobs. Where are they doing this? They're not doing it as much in the traditional areas that we think of, for example, low-skilled manufacturing. They're doing it in hiring consultants to provide services directly for clients in the rest of the world. They're hiring, chip designers to do the chip design for their operations elsewhere. So India is attracting a new form of business, and we should capitalize on it. How do we do that? That's what the book is about.
You know, global capability centers really coming up in India, and we'll get a chance to talk about that. But Dr. Lamba, India should compete for the future rather than competing for the past. So, if you had to list a few focus areas for a future-ready India, what would you put on that list?
When we talk about the past, we usually talk about a cookie-cutter model where we try to go from agriculture to low-skill manufacturing and then services. What we are saying, and to that extent, that model is helped in some part by having authoritarianism. That's how the East Asian countries grew and so on. What we are saying is that now, quarter of the way through the 21st century and looking at 2047 as 100 years of independence and trying to, get India quickly into a middle-income country level by then, what we are trying to suggest is that the vision that we are promoting there is one which tries to capture high value added in the valuation space of products. Right? So when a product is made, it goes from design to manufacturing to allied services attached with manufacturing. Right? If you look at a phone goes to an R&D, a conceptual stage, a design, which is what Apple does in California, then manufactures it in China and now in India, and then it goes to allied services like iTunes, app downloads and so on. And a large part of the value added is at the two corners.
Yeah, not in the middle.
India can actually try to make that bold attempt to jump this queue and go straight, because of all the reasons that Raghu suggested, to try to capture this high value end. And then the low value end, we can dictate whether it is done in India or Vietnam or China and so on.
So listening to both of you, reading the book, it comes down to one thing. You need to invest in human capital. So it's education, it's skilling, it's healthcare. Nobody's going to argue on that, right? But when you look at the evidence, the spends, the real prioritization, the gaps are visible, Raghu?
Absolutely. Look, we often cite this example because it reflects priorities. We are spending over $2 billion subsidizing a Micron factory in Gujarat. That's, about 16,500 crores. That's over 1/3 of our higher education budget. All the money that's been spent on IITs, on IIMs from the center. Of course, states have their own budget. So think about what that means. For 5,000 jobs when this factory is eventually at its peak, we're spending 1/3 of what could be used to create so many more educational institutions. So we're saying, no, let's sort of drop the idea that what we need to do is build up from the lower end to the upper end. That perhaps if we create the minds that can do that chip design directly, we may not need to create chip factories in India. They'll come eventually. As Rohit said, it's connected. Manufacturing is connected to the ideas, to the patents, to the intellectual property. But let's focus on our strengths. And our strengths today lies more in the realm of brains rather than brawn. But we need to generate those brains, and not just in the IITs, but all across the board.
So, you've set me off in a bunch of different directions, but very simple question. Share an example of an investment in human capital done right in the Indian context, which has yielded, great returns, which needs national level replication.
So, we have a lot of examples of entrepreneurs in the book. One example is PC Mustafa, whose father was a laborer collecting ginger root and putting it on a truck to be carried away. Mustafa failed 6th grade and went back to work with his father as a laborer on the farm. A teacher came by and said, Mustafa, why are you doing this? Why don't you come back to school? And Mustafa took that chance and essentially was
did
hard.
fantastically at math.
Did fantastically at math. Then graduated from school, got into one of the NITs, so this is where education helps. Went for jobs abroad, came back through the IIMs and started a business, ID Fresh Foods. We're talking to another entrepreneur yesterday who was telling us how quickly he distributes those products. That is, what he started with was something very simple, fresh idli batter. But how to distribute it quickly before it gets stale, that requires logistics, that requires science. To prevent wastage, that requires management skills. That has expanded across the board. And, this is now employing so many people. Think about it. A laborer's son making that leap all through the magnification power of education. That's the lesson we need to learn. How do we make this possible for so many more Indians? We need 1,000 people like Mustafa, maybe tens of thousands.
And we're going to talk about what it'll take to spur that many Mustafas. But, this idea of like a brawn approach versus a brain approach, and I get it and you've alluded to it, but again, if you can really drive that point home, the brawn approach that we are taking, the brain approach that we need to pivot to, certainly for me, like big infrastructure rollout seems more of the brawn type of approach.
So you see, the government has actually done very, very well in the last decade or so in a concerted push to roll out various kinds of infrastructure, right? Whenever it has gone into mission mode, whether it was building toilets, opening bank accounts, building the roads that you just said, right? Now, there are lots of good ideas out there. It's not like we have come up with the ideas. We've tried to bring them all together in the book. One of the big set of ideas that are out there is in the national education policy. We are big fans of that document. Most of the arguments there are very, very good. Now, what it would take is take that mission mode in which you did brawn, bring that mission mode into the brain, which is the national education policy, and just run with it. Just run with it at every level of government.
And part one of that mission mode is we have 35% malnutrition amongst kids, young kids. That is going to stunt their growth, both their physical growth, their mental growth, and make them much less capable as adults of functioning. Why not, as mission mode, end malnutrition? Now, we have states which have brought it down to the level of OECD countries, for example, Kerala. Why not learn the lessons from Kerala and apply it everywhere else in the country? This is a travesty that many parts of India have higher malnutrition than sub-Saharan Africa at this point. We can't dismiss it, face it, and recognize that we're going to look every year and see, has the mission mode succeeded? Through good data and evaluation, where exactly are we?
My endeavor is to always make it as real for our viewers as possible. And I saw certain references in the book which I know they'll understand. direct services exports. Everyone understands IT services. You've outlined the potential beyond IT and saying, that's an example of India capitalizing on its potential. Just flesh that out a little bit.
Think, for example, of consulting, right? During the pandemic, consultants across the developed world started doing everything at a distance. They traveled much less, they were very happy, but they could also make presentations to the clients. From Denver, they could make it to Chicago and vice versa. So that was a revelation that you didn't need to be in the same country, you didn't need to be in the same location. And then people started thinking, well, if we can consult from Chicago to Denver, why can't we do it from Bangalore to Denver? And so, now what you're seeing is a whole bunch of firms. This is a big feature which we talk less about. You talked about the GCCs, but even consulting firms hiring a lot of people in India, not for the back office, but how can I get them to talk directly to clients now? Can they be part of the same consulting team? That's an opportunity. How do we get more people to that level? Because today, labor arbitrage is very difficult at the low end of manufacturing. We're competing not just with China, we're competing with Vietnam, with Bangladesh. At the high end, where we have the unique ability of speaking English relative to, say, China or even Vietnam, there we don't have that much competition.
And but so that's where we should focus.
Our labor arbitrage is much easier because we are 1/4 the cost of a consultant in the West.
But direct services are all over. Even, for example, the UK is, for example, really short of doctors in the National Health Service. India can provide those doctors. This is also a direct service.
And you can extend to legal,
yes, medical,
even architectural. Yeah. There's so much capacity and space there. Reforms. And the list is a tough one that you put out there. You've talked about governance reforms, you've talked about reforms to human capital formation, you've talked about reforms generally to spur innovation. You've both worked in government. I would say from the outside, that's a big ask. So comment more on the viability, because I think people will get the general drift and, of course, the specifics when they read the book. But the viability piece.
I think the viability is why we wrote the book. So in the sense that, we should not get lackadaisical or lazy about the fact that everything is going well and we are Vishwaguru and whatnot, is that there needs to be actually a serious concerted debate about first of all about the content of the reforms and about how we're going to implement them. And I think this first of all requires a recognition that there are these three sets of challenges that you outline: governance, building human capital of our people, and really just spurring innovation. And this requires a very healthy and considerate, and we think it's possible. It's whenever we have put our mind to things, whether it's in governance, whether it's, for example, the Right to Information Act or introducing the Goods and Services Tax, things change, things have moved. Now there is a sense of urgency that we want to bring to the table, is because India has a unique opportunity of having a very large demographic dividend. The biggest question we as citizens and our government should be obsessed with it: can we grow rich before we grow old?
And can we create the jobs
to
employ these people?
Absolutely.
Now, we look at it from the jobs perspective. How do we bring the jobs? We ask the opposite question also. How do you make people that everybody wants to employ? How do we get... So we already talked about people everybody wants to employ at the higher level. People who've been through the IITs, through the IIMs, everybody wants to employ them. They're coming to India to look for them. How can we expand that mass so much more? How can we give everybody a chance to be a Mustafa?
Exactly, because the people that Mustafa hires for the idli batter business are, a different sort of group of people beyond the IIMs and the IITs. There's one very important piece, and I want to spend some time talking about this: pluralism, free speech, independent institutions, vibrant civil society, checks and balances on government. You argue these are critical ingredients for a creative, high value added breakthrough economy. Not everybody will get that link easily. So, flesh it out for us.
Let's talk about it. One of the things we say is you want better government services. How do you get better government services? You need to decentralize so that people can see who's providing those services. Who can I complain to if in fact I'm not getting good housing or good health services? A good example is Delhi, where because Delhi is much more like a municipality than a state, You have seen an improvement in the quality of the schools, the mohalla clinics that the AAP party is providing. That's an example of decentralization providing those public services. But also you need the right to protest if you're not getting the right services. That means you should have the democratic right to protest. Your ability to protest should be protected by your democratic rights. So that's number one. Second, how do you protest when you don't know what's going on? You need the data. There has to be transparency about government performance. People should be able to put out the data. The government should be required to put out the data, not suppress inconvenient data. The government itself should be open to criticism, because when you're open to criticism, you know that you are doing the wrong thing. You may have to change course. Again, a strength of democracy. But most important in this is that if we want a creative economy, you want to have the ability to go against the establishment, whether you're a scientist or whether you are a radical student protester. Because often from the radical student protesters come the scientists. Steve Jobs, look at a picture of him when he was young. He looks like a hippie who just, long hair and all that, but he was a radical. But he created one of the most important products in history, which is the iPhone. So I think that it's a package.
Yeah, because when I think about it, I think sort of challenge yourself, challenge your ideas is kind of flip way of describing innovation. I mean, what is that?
Also,
you
different
sort of
countries,
challenge in different ways.
Different
to get a
countries,
challenging mindset.
Different countries have different temperaments. Like what works for China doesn't necessarily. We are a different society than China. What works for America doesn't necessarily work in India. We have now evolved into a country where the certain notion of democracy runs in our veins. The idea that we go out and vote every. This is a core part of who we are as people. And I think we have to work within this model and make it work the best for us, both in a moral, ethical, economic and political way. And I think what we're trying to argue in the book is that all of this does come together. This does come together in a model, both in terms of society, politics and economics, which is what we're calling the India way. And I think it needs more democracy, not less. It needs more decentralization, not less.
I should acknowledge we're sitting outside, so we have some thumping music.
Yeah,
and,
it's very happening. You're giving us some background score.
And drums that pop up every once in a while. I think trying to drum up our spirits when it comes to this conversation. One final question to both of you. Where we are today, and I didn't lead with that, but we've touched upon it. So sort of hits and misses checklist, if I could request Raghu, you to go first.
On
where we are today, economy-wise.
Yeah, so, one of the chapters of the book, the chapter 13, talks about where we are headed and whether it's the right path. And in imitating Gandhi and Hind Swaraj, we sort of let somebody ask the questions, which way aren't we headed on the right path, and why do we need to change? I do think that on what is good, some of what the government is doing on implementation, infrastructure, GST after a rocky beginning, but then the rollout, those are all useful things which are taking us in a right direction. We need better infrastructure. We do need a better revenue system. But also where we are missing, I think, is the reverse of decentralization. We're centralizing even more. And to some extent, there is a suppression of democracy. We need more free speech, more debate of some of, and this would be the wrong time to give up what will set us on course to be a much stronger economy going forward. So even if we forget the value that our people have found from democracy, not just elections, but what happens between elections, even if you neglect that, for our future, it is very important to continue to be strongly democratic.
Rohit?
I think one thing I'd add to that is I think we would like the conversation around policy to kind of expand, especially during times of elections, beyond reservations and government jobs and direct transfers. I think democracy is much more than that, than just saying कि मैं कितना transfer दे रहा हूँ और वो कितना transfer दे रहा है. And I think what we would like to have is a robust debate and discussion amongst intellectuals, amongst the media, that sort of percolates to the people that they should be the one asking for more, for much more.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for your time. I know these are hectic days for you. Congratulations on the book. And it's an easy read. It's not just, for economists. it's easily digestible by someone who isn't an economist. So thank you.
Thank you very
for
much.
saying
Appreciate
that.
it.
It's more credible coming from you.